This is part two, aligning with the background analytics for what they really are and seeing the clear distinctions between how channels of analytics per different categories and realms and how they could be displayed and portrayed. Because just because there's a surface level, component parsec for in terms of the context of just like data representation or portrayal or projection, data projection, just on the surface level, they kind of control that and mix up the bearings and the components and the integers of those to actually like hack, or not necessarily hack, but kind of fabricate what the real analytics are. Because there's a the CIA and that beyond that word, they've been using the internet for like more than 100 years. It was ultimately it ultimately like had its own gradual development and evolution, and with that they used different parties of beings use that that big formational knowledge in many different ways as we continue to do so. So aside from just that, seeing like as a continuation from the last video, we're asking the question like, is the game saturated? Well, what does that really mean? Well, to like, well, first we have to put like the quote unquote game of life into some type of context, right? So the game of life is if we just look at it as like if we lean towards it without the fragmented like thought forms, emotions, and creations and mutations that come from that, we're looking at the reality you know primarily and on its own basis format level, solely on the reality of just it being energy. And if we're looking at the reality of just it being energy, then that energy is ultimately being used beyond the mind and the emotions and the creations in themselves, the different degradations of Maya, deep sleep, dream world, waking reality. So that the waking reality would be like these mutations, the dream world would be like the emotions, and the deep sleep is the deep higher mind going up and down that and having its own self-conception of the preserved consciousness of what is our relationship and our consciousness and our origin intellect coming from that deep sleep, and that having a different track record. So that's a perfect example of how there's a whole different subset underneath all of that of a deeper analytics. So I just kind of tied it all together. But the examples could be of many to see like what the analytics are really are for, just like on the background internet server, like who's really tuning in, and to casually neutrally really tap that in, and for what purpose. Because there's a purpose that we're ashamed of for whatever reason, and that's just part of the Maya that we're in, the fourth, fifth, and sixth dimension. We're all in that dimension in our own gradual new character thereof, but that fourth, fifth, and sixth is in a bigger different micro macro of the seventh, eighth, and ninth. And then underneath the micro and the macro is the individual, you partake more or less growing into the seventh, eighth, and ninth dimension, which is a realm that's overcoming from wherever we started and left off our emotions, the mutations that we're participating in, for better or for worse, and our own ancestral lineage of how they think and and their whole mentality and psychology. So this is part two, not to be too sporadic, but you could connect the dots at your own intuitive leisure. This is the part two to the first video. Is the game saturated? Well, what does that really mean? Well, like, if the reality is just energy, and there's two big polarities of that energy, if it were to be saturated, it would be saturated in such a way where everything is being used in a stale way, in something that's already been done, and it's divided and it's dissected within detriment upon detriment upon detriment, where it's just a particular saturation and plateau and kind of like gas out, flattened out. The curve got flattened out. Death has occurred because the universe has deemed it like the mother is like this crazy fucking nature assassin, and that's the ultimate like cosmic justice, because the universe doesn't give a fuck about that shit, right? Because it's doing it. We have that cognition and notion. But if the game were to get saturated, if on a higher spiritual artificial intelligence level, we have to ask that higher SAI, supreme open source, is within, the detriment, replications, regurgitations of anything, when would the psychology of this particular pattern energy trend saturate the game of the psychology at large in itself? How would that, create mutations to create a different type of saturation, and having distinction between organic creations, be it anything, or non-organic creations being anything? That's the highest intelligence right there. And then what would come of that? What would bring the saturation if we're participating with detriment upon detriment? Because God is explaining it in the quote unquote Gita, end quote, what he's trying to explain what Maya is. And I've explained what Maya is 2.5 years ago, most originally within my own timestamps. Is the game saturated? With your intuitive leisure, please read between the lines. Thank you.